How strong was the Emperor, really? That question follows me into sleep and drags me back out again. I was at Ulanor, just a remembrancer, nothing more, sent to witness a victory and preserve it for history. The sanctioned chronicles tell a simple legend. The Emperor meets the Ork Warlord in single combat and fells him with a sword of fire. A neat, shining story, perfect for children on a million worlds. But the scene I saw did not fit the story they later carved into stone. When the Orcs surged forward, the Emperor didn't rush to meet it. He didn't brace, didn't shout, didn't posture. He only lifted a hand, as if asking a hall to quiet itself, and reality misbehaved. The green skin didn't fall, it didn't bleed, it didn't even die. It simply stopped being. One instant, a roaring mass of muscle and crude metal, then an absence so complete my mind struggled to accept it had ever occupied space at all. Even the Primarchs reacted, not with battlefield ferocity, but with something disturbingly human, hesitation. Some recoiled, some looked away, their pride, their certainty, gone in an instant, as if they'd glimpsed a depth beneath him that terrified them. And then his attention moved across the gathered hosts, and for the briefest moment it touched me. I've never found language for that sensation. It was not pain, not pressure, not fear alone, though it contained pieces of all three. It was the horrible clarity of being fully known. Every memory I'd buried, every private weakness, every secret I'd never confessed to anyone, laid open without effort, not examined like a specimen, not weighed like a criminal's confession, simply comprehended in totality by something vast and indifferent to my attempts at concealment. What kind of being can undo existence with a gesture? What kind of father can reshape the minds of his own sons as easily as a scribe edits a line? My name is Jalan Ma. Once I carried a data slate and a Vox recorder for the Great Crusade, tasked with preserving triumphs and tragedies alike. Now I am only the custodian of a truth too dangerous to repeat and too terrible to forget. Even speaking the word Ulanor feels like reciting a forbidden rite, like calling something back that I have spent decades trying not to remember. You know the approved version of that day. The Greenskin Empire broken at last, Horus Lupercal raised to War Master, the Emperor departing for Terra to bury himself in a secret labor beneath the palace. A hinge point in Imperial history, retold so often it has worn smooth. What you have been told is a shadow, carefully shaped, comfortingly familiar. I know, because I helped write it. The official remembrancer accounts praise the Emperor's martial skill, his personal valor, his duel with the Ork leader, Urluk Urg, they would later call it, and the heroic killing blow delivered with a blazing blade. It makes a satisfying myth. It gives the Imperium a scene it can paint on chapel walls and stamp onto medals. It also makes people sleep. The truth is shorter, simpler, and infinitely worse. I stood among the mortal ranks that day, one more anonymous figure in a sea of humanity, present to document greatness as gods moved in our midst. Even before the ceremony began, the scale was beyond comprehension. An entire valley refashioned into a parade ground vast enough to display the assembled power of multiple legion detachments. Hundreds of thousands of Imperial army soldiers arranged with such mathematical precision that, from a distance, they looked less like men and more like a pattern, like fields of grain swaying in the harsh light of that conquered world. Their uniforms remained pristine despite the omnipresent dust, as if order itself could push back the grit of Ulanor. Then came the Astartes, the angels of death. No picked capture, no sculpture, no paragraph of reverent prose can convey what it is to stand near them. They were not merely tall, they were engineered. Monuments shaped into the outline of warriors, armored in ceramite and myth. Their stillness was more intimidating than any roar. They didn't need to threaten to make you feel small, and even they were eclipsed by their gene fathers. The Primarchs were there, demigods made tangible. I remember Magnus, that single eye burning with a light that felt too bright to belong to biology. I remember Sanguinius, wings casting a shadow that seemed to stretch beyond physics. I remember Mortarion, whose presence made every breath feel thin, as if the air itself feared him. Angron was violence barely leashed. Corax, the Khan, Dawn, names that still carry weight like iron. To look directly at them was to feel something in your mind crack, the sudden comprehension of your own insignificance. And yet, even these beings, these conquerors, these legends, were not the center. They were satellites, whether they admitted it or not, orbiting the true gravity of that gathering. The Emperor. How do you describe him? I've spent a lifetime circling the question like a moth around a flame. My hands still shake when I try to set it down, not from cowardice alone, but because words are too small for him. Yes, he appeared as a man. That much is always said. But stating it is like calling a star a light. The understatement borders on sacrilege. He did not need to speak to command attention. He did not need to move to dominate the space around him. The golden armor, the noble and terrible beauty, those details are the ones artisans replicate in statues and frescoes across the Imperium. They are not false, so much as they are uselessly incomplete. His physical form was merely the smallest part of his presence. When he stepped onto those plains, I felt him before I truly saw him. We all did. A pressure behind the eyes, a sudden, unbearable awareness that something immense had turned its focus onto a single point in time and space. The air seemed charged, not with electricity, but with meaning, as if reality remembered it was being watched and straightened itself in response. In that moment, I understood, with startling clarity, why people drop to their knees before what they believe is divine. It is not always worship. Sometimes it is simply the body's way of keeping itself intact. Standing upright in his presence felt like resisting a gravity that had quietly multiplied. The triumph unfolded as planned, pageantry and proof. The Emperor seated upon a colossal golden throne built for the occasion, a ceremonial echo of something deeper and older. Legion banners passed in review. Tanks rolled by. Titans strode like walking cathedrals, shaking the ground with each step. I know there was thunderous noise. I know there were cheers. Yet my memory of sound is strangely blank, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Time did not move correctly that day. Hours passed, or perhaps only moments. Then came the fracture, unscheduled, uninvited, and utterly transformative. The attack burst from bunkers Imperial sweeps had somehow missed. Not an army. Ulanor had already been broken. This was a final defiance, a suicide thrust aimed at severing the Imperium at its moment of celebration. At the front charged an orc, larger than any I'd ever seen, a hulking monster in crude metal and pistons, roaring a challenge that seemed to rattle the air. Later they gave it a name. I do not remember hearing it spoken aloud. Names did not matter anymore. The Emperor rose. That single motion silenced more than voices. It quieted thought itself. The world narrowed to one point. Him. The histories call what followed a battle. They describe a sword drawn, blows exchanged, strength matched, skill tested. It is all invention, elegant invention, carefully staged for an audience that needed a legend. What truly happened was almost casual. The Emperor lifted his hand, palm outward. An ordinary gesture, the kind a man might use to halt a servant mid-sentence. The orc was still far off, charging like an avalanche made of hate and muscle and iron. And then it was gone. No flash, no psychic lightning, no explosive spectacle. One moment it existed, roaring, real, undeniable, and the next there was nothing. Not smoke, not ash, not even the satisfying proof of a corpse. It was as if the universe had edited the creature out of the scene and smoothed the page where it had been. The silence afterward was not merely the absence of sound. It was a brief absence of everything, a stutter in existence, as though reality had forgotten its own rules. What horrified me most was the effortlessness. He didn't strain, he didn't gather power in any visible way. He simply decided, and existence obeyed. Only then did I truly notice the Primarchs. Those demigods, crafted for conquest, built to rule, were kneeling, not in ceremonial order, not because anyone commanded them. They knelt like frightened children who had just learned the world could be rewritten. Some bowed so low their heads nearly touched the ground. Some shook. Even Magnus, so gifted, so arrogant in his mastery, pressed his hands to his temples, a thin line of blood leaking from his eye, as if his own senses had been overwhelmed by what he'd perceived. They had seen more than we mortals could. Or perhaps they had understood what we could only feel. Then the Emperor's gaze swept the masses. When it reached me, it was like being turned inside out in a single instant. Every thought, every shame, every buried truth, exposed not to judgment, but to total comprehension. For a fraction of a second I understood what it meant to be seen by him, not as a man, not as an imperial servant, but as a temporary arrangement of matter. Atoms shaped into a consciousness so fragile he could alter or erase it with less effort than I might use to brush away an insect. In that instant, I understood why the Primarchs had knelt. The gulf between him and even his most magnificent sons was not a matter of degree. It was a difference in kind. After that, the rest of the day unfolded like a dream I watched through glass. The ceremony resumed. Horus was elevated to War Master. Speeches were delivered, honors were bestowed. I recorded everything with trained hands while my mind remained fixed on the moment the universe had obeyed a gesture. That night, alone, I reviewed my recordings. The Ork's unmaking was not there. In its place was a perfect heroic scene, the Emperor engaging the monster in conventional combat, striking it down with a sword in a dramatic display of martial brilliance. It was staged too neatly, framed too well, as if composed for posterity rather than captured from life. But it had never happened. I checked other accounts. I spoke carefully to other remembrances. They all carried the same memory, the false version. The elegant lie was spreading fast, hardening into fact. By morning I began to doubt myself. Had I imagined it? Had the psychic pressure of that gathering bent my mind into hallucination? Was it merely mortal frailty in the presence of gods? Then I noticed the subtler truth. I was being watched. No custodes at my door. No interrogator with a blade and a list of questions. Nothing so crude. Instead, my path began to curve as if guided by invisible hands. Assignments altered, access restricted for bureaucratic reasons. Conversations became harder to arrange. Doors that had been open were suddenly closed. I was being isolated, measured, tested, waiting to see if I would speak of what I remembered. I didn't. Some instinct, deeper than courage, kept my mouth shut. I signed my name to the sanitized narrative. I helped distribute the legend. I played the part expected of me, but I did not forget. In time, my work was moved away from the Emperor and the Primarchs. I was given important duties, documenting the human side of the crusade, common soldiers, compliant worlds, the spread of governance and culture. Necessary work, certainly. Also safely distant from the center of power. I told myself it was routine, a rotation. No single remembrancer could follow the Emperor forever. Yet I knew the real reason. I had seen something I was not meant to see. I had remembered something I was not meant to remember, and somehow, whether by design or by accident, he knew I had. When the Emperor returned to Terra and disappeared into his secret labor beneath the palace, I tried to convince myself Ulanor would fade into insignificance, buried under the avalanche of larger events. I was wrong. What I witnessed there was only the first glimpse into an abyss so vast that, even now, I struggle to comprehend its depth. But I must try. The truth demands it, even if the truth is dangerous, even if I am the only one who still carries it. After Ulanor, my sleep began to break. Not with ordinary nightmares, but with dreams that left dread clinging to me like ash. In them I stood again on that dusty plain, watching the triumph unfold, only this time I was not merely observing. I was the one being studied, examined with an attention that seemed to pierce flesh and bone and reach for the core of what made me, me. And always, at the moment the Ork ceased to exist, I would look down and find myself dissolving, not from the limbs inward, but from the inside out, as though the essential spark of my identity was being erased first, leaving the body to collapse after. I would wake gasping, clutching at my chest, urgently inventorying my thoughts and memories to prove I was still whole. Nearly a month passed before I understood the dreams were not random trauma. They were a message, a warning. What I had seen could not be unseen. What I knew could not be unknown. But it could be buried, sealed behind fear and self-preservation. That was the choice placed before me. Silence and survival, or truth and annihilation. I chose silence. What else was there? So I continued documenting the glory of the Great Crusade, recording humanity's destiny among the stars, while carrying a truth I barely dared to touch. Even in thought, because I feared that remembering too clearly might draw that attention again. For a while, it seemed to work. The dreams grew less frequent, though they never fully vanished. I was allowed to live, to work, to pretend at normality, at a comfortable distance from the highest towers of imperial power. Then came the summons. 3 years after Ulanor, attached to an expeditionary fleet under the imperial fists, I received orders to return to Terra. No explanation, no stated purpose. A directive that could not be refused. The journey took weeks. Weeks filled with terror masquerading as logic. I built theories in my head, each worse than the last, until I was certain I was being recalled for execution, that the grace I'd been granted had ended. The reality was both better and worse. At the spaceport, I was met not by custodes, not by the Sigillites' agents, but by a minor administrator, a grey man with a grey voice, who informed me, with practiced indifference, that I had been reassigned to the Office of Chronological Accuracy and Factual Verification, a division of the Remembrancer Order responsible for reviewing, standardizing, and approving historical accounts before they entered the official record. In other words, I had been made an editor of other people's truths. My new world was a windowless room deep inside the administrative complexes around the palace, lined with data stacks and cogitator terminals. My task was simple on paper. Review accounts from across the crusade, compare them to approved templates, flag inconsistencies, correct deviations, and forward anything problematic to higher authorities. I was being asked to sanitize history systematically to help build the narrative that would replace reality. The irony did not escape me. I had watched truth be erased in an instant on Ulanor, and now I was being used as a tool to erase the truths of others. At first it felt like punishment dressed as promotion, a quiet cruelty worthy of minds operating on scales far beyond my own. But as months passed, a pattern emerged in the material that crossed my desk. Reports of impossible phenomena, accounts of the Emperor or the Primarchs bending the rules of the world around them, moments where reality itself seemed to warp in their presence. And then, almost always, the same familiar pressure to correct, to standardize, to make the story fit the shape the Imperium needed. And that is when I understood. Ulanor wasn't just a single lie. It was a method. Every one of those anomalies was stamped for special handling. Everyone demanded the most aggressive revision protocols we had, and in case after case, the remembrancers who wrote the raw versions didn't simply get corrected. They vanished from the work. Officially, they suffered mental collapse, or were reassigned for recuperation, or transferred to distant postings where their words would reach no ears and stir no questions. That was when it finally landed on me. I wasn't unique. I wasn't the only witness who had glimpsed what lay behind the polished surface. I also wasn't the only one being quietly pushed into silence. You might think that knowledge would soothe me. Shared burden, shared danger. It did the opposite. It sharpened my fear into something colder and more constant. Because this wasn't a patchwork of convenient edits. It was a machine. Vast, methodical, built to run for years. Someone, something was shaping truth with patient, deliberate hands. And the question that followed became an infection in my mind. What are they hiding? And why does it require this scale of erasure? Against every instinct that had kept me alive so far, I began building a private archive. Not grand. Not obvious. Just enough. Copies of unrevised testimonies, notes on which remembrances were removed and how quickly, and patterns in the edits. Repeated substitutions, familiar phrases inserted like plaster over cracks. I wanted the outline of the hidden thing, even if I could never see it directly. I knew what it meant if I was caught. There would be no trial, no debate, just a disappearance as tidy as the ones I was documenting. But something in me refused to remain a tool forever. If my own memories were destined to be sacrificed for the sake of a clean narrative, then I wanted, at the very least, to understand the altar. Half a year into that assignment, I found a file that nearly broke my ability to pretend. Among the reports marked for extreme correction was a sequence written by a remembrancer attached to the word-bearers. Her name was Cyrene Volantion. She had documented the compliance of a world called Kur. The approved summary described a stubborn human culture resisting peaceful integration, regrettable necessity, measured force. The usual language of inevitability, designed to make conquest sound like reluctant medicine. Cyrene's unrevised account was something else entirely. It described the Emperor appearing before Lorgar, who had spent decades teaching conquered worlds to worship his father as a god. Cyrene wrote that the Emperor did not merely reprimand him. He made an example of him. A city had been razed in the Emperor's honor. Cyrene recorded that it was reduced to ruin in a single, indifferent instant. No siege, no bombardment, no conventional destruction. One moment, it stood as a monument. The next, it was ash and silence. Then, before the ashes were even cold, the word-bearers were compelled to kneel within them, not ceremonially, not in organized parade formation, forced, like sinners, pressed into the dust of their own devotion. And Cyrene described something worse than the public humiliation. As Lorgar knelt, weeping, broken, Cyrene wrote that the Emperor did something to him that left no bruises and required no spoken command. It was will alone, applied with the effortless precision of an editor correcting a page. Not persuasion, not argument, alteration. A change made at the root of thought itself, as if the Primarch's mind were a manuscript and the Emperor had decided certain lines needed to be rewritten. I had to stop reading twice, because the parallels to Ulanor were too exact. The same casual impossibility, the same authority that didn't fight reality, it instructed reality. Except Ulanor had been directed outward at a Xenos enemy. This was turned inward, against the Emperor's own son. That was the moment my questions became truly poisonous. What kind of being reshapes a Primarch's identity as easily as rearranging words? What kind of father does that? I knew those thoughts were treason even as they formed. But once they existed, they did not leave. They burrowed, they multiplied. And still, because I was trained, because I was afraid, because survival has its own rituals, I did my job. I revised Cyrene's testimony into something bland and administrative. I replaced horror with redeployment. I replaced ash with restructuring. I turned a psychic violation into a note fit for an office ledger. All the while, a second fear grew beside the first. If he could do that to a Primarch, one engineered to resist psychic intrusion, what could he do to an ordinary human mind? What had he already done to mine? The thought froze me. It made every memory feel unstable. How could I trust my own recollection if it could be altered without my knowledge? How could I trust my own skepticism if even my doubts might be a planted mechanism, a clever fail-safe designed to flush out anyone dangerous enough to question? I began inspecting myself with the obsession of a man searching his skin for invisible parasites. I hunted for gaps, for mismatched reactions, for ideas that felt like they came from somewhere else. I found nothing definitive. But not finding proof is not the same as finding safety. The uncertainty remained, and it metastasized into a permanent companion. Even so, I continued. The archive grew, carefully, quietly, while I lived beneath the shadow of a truth I could neither hold cleanly nor discard completely. And the more I learned, the more certain I became of one thing. Whatever the Emperor was, the Imperium's official idea of divinity was a child's attempt to name a storm. He was not a god in the old human sense. He was something outside our categories, something without a proper word. And whatever plans he carried for humanity, I no longer believed they matched the comforting stories we were taught to recite. As months on terror stretched into years, I built habits meant to hide my private work. By day, I performed loyal service to the sanctioned narrative. By night, I documented the world that narrative was burying. I created a concealed archive inside my modest HAB unit. Data slates hidden inside ordinary containers, physical notes tucked where a casual search wouldn't linger. Everything encoded in a cipher of my own design. It was around then that I began noticing the smallest signs of attention. Nothing blatant, nothing I could point to and call proof. A servitor that passed my door at the same minute each evening. File access requests that felt less like bureaucracy and more like a ledger of my curiosity. The occasional sensation, irrational, unshakable, that someone was present when I was alone. At first I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but one incident snapped that illusion. I had been reviewing scattered accounts of the Council of Nicaea, where the Emperor placed limits on psychic practice within the legions. The public record framed it as reasoned debate followed by wise judgment. Magnus admonished, the librarius curtailed but partially preserved in modified form. Yet in the margins of remembrancer testimony, hints surfaced, an undertone of something far more overwhelming. Descriptions of the Emperor demonstrating his own psychic authority in ways that left even the strongest psychers among his sons shaken. Mentions of his voice bypassing air and eardrum entirely, landing directly in the minds of everyone present with such force that some staggered afterward, bleeding from eyes and ears. I was collating these discrepancies when I sensed movement at the edge of my workspace. A figure stood in the doorway. A custodian, golden armor catching what little light the room offered, guardian spear held with casual ease, as if he had stepped in from a corridor rather than a battlefield. He did not speak. He did not threaten. He simply watched me. I don't know why I counted, but I did. 37 seconds, each one a hammer blow in my chest. Then he turned and left without a word. The meaning was unmistakable. You may continue for now, but you are seen. That night I destroyed a large portion of my archive. Not all. I couldn't bring myself to erase everything, but enough to give me plausible innocence if my quarters were searched. After that, I shifted my methods. I stopped recording patterns on slates. I stopped keeping notes. I forced myself to become my own living repository, storing connections in memory alone, where they could not be seized so easily. Not long after that warning, the galaxy began to tilt. Rumors filtered back to Terra. Friction among the legions, old rivalries sharpening, Primarchs clashing in ways that felt less like competition and more like fracture. Whispers that Horus, raised to War Master at Ulanor, was growing increasingly independent in how he prosecuted the Great Crusade. Official channels dismissed it, of course. Normal strain. Natural disagreements. A vast military spanning countless star systems would have friction, nothing more. But from my position, sorting reports as they arrived, I began to see the outline of a different pattern. At first it was small. Expeditions that failed to check in on time. Troop movements that didn't match strategic necessity. Communication protocols altered without clear justification. Signals that vanished into silence. Then came Istvan, the atrocity that did not fit any template. The purging of loyal legions by their brothers. The revelation that Horus, the most favored son, had turned against the Emperor. The shock on Terra was real. Deep. Even those of us who harbored private doubts did not truly believe such betrayal was possible. The Primarchs were supposed to be above petty hunger, above weakness. They were the Emperor's vision made flesh, perfection given purpose. If they could fall, what did that say about the vision itself? In the chaos that followed, as Terra began preparing for the possibility of war reaching the throne world, my office changed overnight. We stopped correcting history. We began manufacturing it in real time. We were ordered to explain the unexplainable, to justify the unjustifiable. Horus was not a rebel in the political sense we were told. He was corrupted, tainted by Xenos influence or warp entities or some external infection encountered in the void. The Primarchs who joined him were deceived, coerced, compromised. The schism could not be allowed to appear internal. It had to be presented as an outside assault using inside tools. The Emperor remained flawless. His vision remained pure. Any suggestion otherwise was not merely wrong, it was dangerous, potentially traitorous, potentially sympathetic. So I wrote what I was told to write. I shaped the lies. I helped package the war into a story the Imperium could stomach. And I kept investigating, because the more I connected fragments, the more unsettling the pattern became. Nearly every time the Emperor displayed the kind of reality-commanding power I had witnessed at Ulanor, dysfunction followed later, sometimes years later, in those who had been present. Not immediately, not predictably, but consistently enough to be more than coincidence. Magnus's desperate psychic warning that shattered protective wards. Lorgar's slide from most faithful into the first true heretic. Angron's worsening fury. Perturabo's slow rot of resentment. Each had, at some point, been subjected to direct contact with their father. Mind against mind. And each emerged altered. Subtly, at first, catastrophically in time. I cannot prove causation. Even now I can only stitch conjecture from suppressed fragments. But I came to believe something that terrified me more than any political explanation ever could. The heresy was not simply rebellion or ambition. It was a kind of psychic immune response, a rejection, a violent reaction to proximity with a presence too vast for even transhuman minds to hold safely. As if contact with what the Emperor truly was corroded the structures of identity, even in his sons, until fracture became inevitable. As the war accelerated and the War Master's forces pushed toward Terra, my work turned frantic. The flow of material demanding sanitization became a flood. Reports of impossible feats by loyalists and traitors alike. Accounts of the battlefield itself bending around the will of Primarchs. Descriptions of things that should not exist stepping through thinning walls between the material world and the immaterial. Much of it was hysteria, shock, the fog of war. But within the noise were threads that rang with genuine terror. Witnesses describing legionaries changing, not just in armor or doctrine, but in essence. Some growing stronger in ways physics could not justify, yet also becoming more unstable, more extreme, as if the Emperor's methods of creation were accelerating out of control in some and unraveling in others. Transformation and collapse occurring at once, in different directions, along different vectors. And beneath it all was a creeping sense that reality itself was loosening, becoming more pliable, more responsive to belief and will. The boundary between the materium and the warp thinning as the conflict intensified. It was during that period that the dream returned. The same vision that had haunted me after Ulanor, standing on dusty ground, watching the Emperor erase the Ork with a gesture, feeling myself begin to dissolve from within. But this time, the dream went further. I did not slip into oblivion. I was drawn inward, absorbed, integrated, my consciousness pulled like a thread into a vast lattice of other minds. A psychic architecture so immense it dwarfed the physical world around it. And at the center of that structure was him, not merely a man, not even a god in any comforting sense. In the dream, he was a principle, an organizing force wearing human form the way a blade wears a handle, as an interface, not a definition. And suddenly, with the sick clarity dreams sometimes bring, I understood what he was attempting. The Great Crusade, the Primarchs, the entire Imperial project. Not conquest for its own sake, not simple unification, not even survival. Transcendence, the elevation of humanity from scattered individuals into a single unified consciousness, capable of reshaping reality by collective will, with the Emperor as both catalyst and template. A species-scale apotheosis. I woke from that vision not screaming, but staring into the dark with something close to awe. And in that sharp moment of waking clarity, I recognized the dream for what it was, not merely my mind trying to cope, but a transmission, an understanding allowed to take root in me. Whether it came from the Emperor directly or was spillover from the warp's growing turbulence, I cannot say. But for the first time since Ulanor, I felt I had glimpsed not only the fact of his power, but its direction, and that purpose was both magnificent and horrifying. We were not meant to remain as we are, separate minds with private thoughts and individual destinies. We were raw material for something larger, something new, with the Emperor as its heart and governing intellect. Some would call that divinity. Others would call it tyranny on a cosmic scale. I no longer know where the line truly lies. All I know is what I witnessed, what I assembled from buried truth, and what years of reflection have forced me to accept. The Emperor of mankind is not, and perhaps never truly was, human in the way we mean the word. Maybe he began as human stock in some distant age. Maybe he walked among us for millennia, wearing our shape. But what he became in order to steer our species is something fundamentally different. An intelligence so vast it needed a physical form engineered to contain it without spilling into the warp. A mind capable of perceiving and manipulating the underlying scaffolding of reality through sheer psychic intent. That is what I believe flickered into view at Ulanor. Not merely a display of strength, but a brief local failure, or suspension of the glamour that allows lesser beings to perceive him as comprehensible. For one instant, when he erased the Ork with a gesture, I think he stopped pretending to be limited by the constraints that bind the rest of us. The Primarchs understood. They were crafted from him, built to channel fragments of his nature. When the truth surfaced, it resonated with something buried inside them, an echo of the same transcendent potential. That is why they knelt without being told. Not out of worship alone, not even fear alone, but recognition, an instinctive acknowledgement of a hierarchy as unarguable as gravity. And perhaps that glimpse of what they might one day become, of the distance still separating them from the intended final form, of the self that would be lost along the path, was the first seed of discord. To see your future laid bare, and to realize it demands surrender of identity, would shake any consciousness, even one as strong as a Primarch's. For me, an unaugmented human, the revelation was smaller and therefore survivable. I only saw the surface ripples of a depth I couldn't truly understand. But it was enough to change my life, to trap me in hidden inquiry and dangerous knowledge. As Terra prepared for siege and Horus's forces closed toward the Sol system, my work gained a brutal urgency. I wasn't only editing old accounts anymore. I was shaping what the public would believe about events still unfolding, choosing what to preserve for morale and what to cut away to prevent panic, building a story sturdy enough to hold an empire together while the truth tried to tear it apart. In reality, none of us knew whether victory was even possible. The catastrophe was beyond precedent. Half the Imperium's armies turned against itself. Primarchs divided, warp routes choked by storms, and at the head of the traitor host stood Horus Lupercal, once the brightest general of the crusade, now aiming his genius at the empire he helped build. And yet, inside the imperial palace, an eerie calm settled in. Those nearest to the emperor reported no visible uncertainty, no wavering, no sign that the master of mankind doubted his own endgame. Whether that calm was confidence or something far stranger, I could not tell, but I felt it in my bones. Whatever was coming, the official story would never be allowed to describe it honestly. He remained buried in his secret labor beneath the palace, surfacing only at intervals to issue terse directives to the Primarchs and the generals holding the defenses together. Each appearance became an event in my department, picked apart, compared, weighed for what it might imply. Rumors multiplied the way mold grows in a sealed room. Some whispered that he was weakening, drained by whatever work he pursued behind locked doors. Others insisted the opposite, that the crisis was forcing him to become something newer, stranger, stripping away the last thin veneer of humanity. From the fragments I could gather, suppressed notes, half-finished testimonies, my own distant observations, the truth seemed more complicated than either camp could tolerate. He was changing, that much felt undeniable. Yet the change refused simple labels. To the eye, he remained the same commanding figure the crusade had followed. But those permitted near him described an unsettling phenomenon, an increasing difficulty in holding him in the mind. As if awareness itself kept sliding off him unless they forced their thoughts into a narrow, deliberate focus. One account, removed almost the moment it arrived, compared the experience to trying to stare at an intentional absence. Not a rip, not a wound, but a place where the laws of existence had been politely instructed to step aside. It matched too well with what I had felt long ago at Ulanor. The same impression of reality bending around a single point of will. The same sense of power operating beyond the usual vocabulary of psychic phenomena. Only now that force seemed channeled with unprecedented discipline, aimed at a purpose none of us could see clearly. Officially, I was instructed to frame him as the immovable center of Terra's defense, the steady anchor, the fixed point around which resistance turned. That wasn't difficult. In every outward way it was true. Privately, another suspicion began to harden in me. His calm did not come from confidence in a military outcome. It came from distance, perspective. As if the heresy, catastrophic as it was, belonged to a larger sequence he had already accounted for. Not an interruption, but a phase. I should be clear, that was conjecture. Dangerous conjecture I shared with no one. But it aligned with the patterns I'd been collecting for years, with that recurring dream of humanity being drawn towards psychic unification, and with dozens of small decisions the Emperor made that only seemed rational if he was operating on a timeline that stretched far beyond the immediate crisis. When the siege began in earnest, Horus's fleets in orbit, bombardments and assaults grinding against the palace's layered defenses, new reports started flowing into my office. Accounts from the front describing reality itself behaving badly under pressure, time running unevenly between sectors, matter obeying impossible rules, injuries with no conventional cause, symbolism and literal fact blurring until the difference stopped meaning anything. My superiors ordered me to file most of it under fear and fatigue. Exotic weapons, unknown Xenos devices, battlefield confusion. But I couldn't accept that. I had watched the Emperor erase an orc with a gesture. I had felt the world bend on Ulanor. These phenomena weren't random, they were the same principles, just operating at larger scale, with less precision amid the turbulence of an entire world choking on war. The veil between the material realm and the immaterial was thinning. And in that unstable overlap, belief and will were becoming active forces, pressing themselves into the shape of physics. In time, I came to believe this was both the heresy's deepest danger and its true stake. Not merely the fall of an empire or the death of a man on a throne, but the weaponization of humanity's collective psychic potential, a force capable of rewriting existence itself. Horus wanted that power for his own ascent. The Emperor intended it for something else. Caught between these two transhuman wills, reality began to buckle. The ending most citizens know, at least the version we allowed them to know, is fixed in imperial myth. The Emperor and his most loyal sons boarding Horus's flagship, a brutal advance through corrupted decks, the final confrontation, the Emperor grievously wounded, Horus annihilated, and the master of mankind reduced to a ruined shell kept functioning only by the Golden Throne. I helped build that story in the aftermath. I helped polish it into a tragic epic sturdy enough to carry 10,000 years of rule. It contains truth, yes, but it is not the whole truth. I was not on the vengeful spirit. I didn't see the last moments with my own eyes. Few did, and fewer remained intact enough to speak. But in my position, I saw what returned in the beginning. Before the official version hardened, before theology swallowed history whole. Those early accounts were fragmentary and contradictory, as you'd expect from any event that shattered the minds of witnesses. Yet taken together, they suggested something very different from a simple duel of blades. They described a battle happening on multiple planes at once. Physical conflict as a shadow cast by a larger war of will. One of the clearest testimonies came from a custodian who survived only barely, wounded past anything that should have left a living mind. His words, recorded before they could be properly corrected, lingered on one detail above all. Stillness, a chamber warped by forces no mortal mind was meant to interpret. Horus and the Emperor facing one another across a space that felt less like a room and more like a question posed to existence. Time not frozen, but holding its breath, waiting. And then, something no version of proper history ever truly explains. The Emperor hesitated. Not the theatrical pause of a storyteller stretching suspense. Not sentimentality, not paternal weakness. The custodian's account implied something far stranger. Uncertainty. As if the architect of humanity's future had reached a junction he did not fully predict, faced with an outcome whose consequences even his mind could not calculate cleanly. In that sliver of hesitation, Horus struck. Perhaps a physical blow landed. But the decisive attack by every description was psychic. Horus's will amplified by whatever warp powers had flooded into him. It very nearly ended everything. The Emperor was wounded in a manner that exceeded flesh. Damage to the underlying structure of what he was. Fractures along fault lines that may have existed since the moment he ceased being merely human. The custodian's testimony breaks down here into symbols, religious language, impossible metaphors. Attempts to describe sensations too large even for augmented senses. Yet the core repeats across other fragments I've encountered over the decades. At the moment of greatest danger, the Emperor stopped holding back. He stopped confining himself to forms and limits comprehensible to human, Shenji transhuman minds. He ceased being the most powerful being in the galaxy and simply became, in full, whatever his true nature is. The effect was catastrophic. Within that chamber, reality collapsed into something the surviving witness could only render as total negation, followed by perfect definition, as if all possibility was erased, and then a single inevitable truth was forced into place. When perception returned to something like normality, Horus was gone. Not dead in any ordinary sense. Not banished. Removed. Wiped from existence so completely that even the powers that had backed him fell silent, as if the underlying pattern of him had been erased from the structure of reality itself. But the cost was absolute. The Emperor, having manifested something too vast for even his engineered body to contain, fell into a state beyond death yet short of life. His consciousness shattered into fragments, his strength scattered across dimensions, his physical form reduced to a broken vessel. And the Golden Throne, built for a very different purpose in his original design, became his cage and his life support. An anchor to prevent those fragments from dissolving into the warp, and a mechanism to keep whatever essential functions he still performed for humanity from failing. This, I believe, is what truly sits at the heart of the heresy and the Imperium that followed. Not merely betrayal, not merely a civil war with a mythic duel at the end, but a pivot point in a species-level transformation planned across ages, derailed not simply by rebellion, but by unforeseen choices in the final moments. That is my conclusion after decades of hiding, assembling scraps, and refusing to let my mind relax into the comfort of the sanctioned story. And that is why I have lived in fear. To hold even this much knowledge is dangerous. To speak it aloud is heresy by any definition. Yet as my own end draws nearer, I feel compelled to leave a record. Not as absolute truth, how could I pretend to measure a mind like his? But as warning, as perspective, as the testimony of someone who briefly saw behind the veil and survived only because he was small enough to be overlooked. The Emperor is not dead. He is not alive in any human sense. He exists in a category we don't possess language for. His consciousness both unified and fragmented across multiple layers of existence. His body sustained by the throne while his scattered essence remains anchored to the material realm. And despite that broken state, his power remains beyond calculation. A beacon has burned for 10 millennia on the output of his fractured will. The war against the warp continues without rest. The Imperium's psychic defenses and rituals persist, fed directly or indirectly by whatever portion of his true capacity remains accessible through the throne. For years, I have wondered whether this outcome was truly unintended, whether the apparent failure of his secular dream might, in some colder sense, have become its fulfillment by another route. Look at what the Imperium became. A galaxy-wide theocracy centered on one object of worship, countless trillions of minds directed toward a single figure through ritual, fear, devotion, generation after generation. Psychic potential, focused, shaped, channeled along prescribed grooves. Isn't that, in its own brutal way, a form of species-level alignment? Not the enlightened unity the imperial truth promised. Something far harsher, slower, and drenched in suffering, but still a convergence of minds, a narrowing of human intention into a single beam. The methods are different, the timescale is vastly extended, the cost is obscene, yet the direction, if my conjecture holds, remains disturbingly consistent with the goal I glimpsed in that dream. Humanity being forged into a unified psychic entity, capable of reshaping reality through collective will. If that possibility has any merit, it raises questions that make me feel ill. What kind of foresight would it take to accept such a road? What moral calculus could justify that quantity of pain as necessary? Questions I am not equipped to answer. Questions perhaps no human mind can even frame correctly, let alone solve. All I know with certainty is Ulanor, the effortless unmaking of an enemy with a gesture, the sense of reality, obeying, the kind of authority that makes gods seem small and makes ordinary men wish they'd never learned how to see. And I know, deep down, that even that display was only a sliver, a localized loosening of the constraints that allow him to interact with the world without annihilating the world by proximity. After years of forbidden thought, I've come to believe the being we call the Emperor may be the first instance of a new order of existence, neither human nor God, as we previously understood such words, but a principle of consciousness extended across dimensions, operating by laws we have not grasped. The first, but never meant to be the last. Because I believe humanity was intended to follow, to cross the same threshold, to shed the limits we mistake for the definition of self. That was the purpose of the crusade. That was the rationale behind the imperial truth. That was the point of the Webway project, to shepherd our species through an evolutionary passage no organic intelligence has ever crossed safely. Perhaps the plan continues even now, shattered, enthroned, and yet still guiding by paths too indirect for us to recognize. Perhaps the Imperium, in all its brutality, still performs its designed function. Or perhaps the design truly failed, and we are alone in a galaxy of nightmares, with only the broken remnants of an incomprehensible being standing between us and extinction. I don't know. I can't know. Those answers lie beyond any mind still chained to ordinary time. All I can leave is this: my fragmentary glimpse behind the veil, the memory I was never meant to keep, the connections I was never meant to make. And as I approach whatever waits beyond death, dissolution, or absorption into some larger pattern, I find myself haunted and oddly steadied by one final thought. If I am even partly right about him, if he truly perceives across dimensions and sees timelines like a man sees roads, then he always knew I would remember Ulanor. He always knew I would spend my life circling forbidden truths. He always knew I would eventually speak. And he permitted it. Why? That question follows me like a shadow. Maybe my efforts are too small to matter, an insignificant anomaly not worth correcting. Or maybe, more terrifying, this record serves a purpose in a design I cannot fathom. Perhaps doubt is not a flaw, but a required ingredient. A seed of cognitive variation in a species being pushed toward unity. I don't know. I cannot know. But before I vanish into whatever awaits, I leave this testimony, not as certainty, but as warning. The Emperor's true power is not merely creation or destruction, nor psychic domination, nor technological mastery, though he commands all of those when needed. I believe his real power is simpler, colder, and more absolute. Dominion over reality itself, the kind that does not need to explain, the kind that makes perception malleable, the kind that can erase existence and rewrite minds as easily as adjusting a line of text. Whatever he is, whatever he intends, I'm certain of one thing. It is vaster, stranger, and more frightening than any creed we have built to contain it. Even now, in his broken state, I feel the implication of his attention moving across the Imperium, reading patterns we cannot read, nudging events along paths we cannot predict, guiding humanity toward a future we cannot imagine. Or perhaps, most frightening of all, simply watching while we suffer in our trillions, because the pressure of that suffering is the forge required to shape us into what we are meant to become. I offer this not as truth carved in stone, but as the perspective of someone who saw, briefly, imperfectly, behind the veil. The Emperor of mankind is power made manifest. But what that power truly is, and what it has been used to build across human history, remains the greatest mystery of our existence. My name is Jalin Ma. I was there at Ulanor when the Emperor let a fraction of his nature show. I watched him erase an enemy with a gesture. I felt his attention strip me bare, and I have lived ever since with the knowledge that the master of mankind is something far greater and far more terrible than the God we pretend we understand. Remember this, if these words endure. The Emperor protects, but what he protects us from, why he does it, and what it ultimately costs. Those answers could shatter the Imperium more thoroughly than any external foe. Because what authority is more absolute than the kind that never needs to justify itself? What dominion is more complete than the kind that shapes the perceptions of its subjects? What power is more terrifying than the kind that can unmake reality with a thought and alter the minds of demigods with a glance? This is the final conclusion I carry, drawn from a lifetime of hidden inquiry. He is not a tyrant merely because he rules through force. He is a tyrant because, for him, there is no meaningful difference between his will and what is, between desire and law, between the future he chooses for humanity and the inevitable structure of reality itself. That is the truth that began on Ulanor, the revelation that haunted my decades. And now, as I step toward whatever comes next, I surrender it, terrified and strangely calm, to the void or to the unity that may already be waiting.